The wind howling off Lake Michigan didn't just blow through the streets of Chicago that January night. It hunted, it stalked, it searched for any living thing foolish enough to exist outside the fragile shelter of brick and mortar, and when it found that living thing, it tried to kill it. The temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before they could fully leave your lungs, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your bones feel like they might shatter if you moved too quickly. The local news anchors had practically begged the citizens of Chicago to stay indoors, their voices tight with the kind of urgency usually reserved for tornadoes or active shooters. For Marcus Callahan, the concept of indoors was subjective at best. At 61 years old, the former Army Ranger's entire world consisted of a cardboard-lined alcove beneath the rusted steel girders of the Lake Street L train overpass. It wasn't much. A space barely 6 feet wide and maybe 8 feet deep, wedged between a concrete support pillar and a chain-link fence that separated the tracks from the alley below. But it was his. The other ghosts who drifted through Chicago's frozen arteries knew it belonged to the man they called Ghost. They respected the unspoken claim. In a world where nothing belonged to anyone, that small recognition meant everything. Marcus had been fighting a losing battle against post-traumatic stress disorder and an unforgiving economy for more than a decade. His descent into homelessness hadn't been a sudden, catastrophic drop, the kind of fall that makes the evening news. It had been a slow, agonizing slide. One missed shift because of a flashback. One angry outburst at a supervisor who startled him from behind. One too many nights where the nightmares made sleep impossible and work the next day unbearable. He lost his job as a diesel mechanic first, then the small apartment in Albany Park. Then his marriage, though, that had been dying long before he stopped being able to pay rent. And finally, eventually, inevitably, he lost his pride. That went last, stripped away in pieces so small he barely noticed, until one morning he woke up and realized he'd been invisible for so long that he'd started to feel like a ghost even to himself. On this particular night, the night that would change everything, his survival hinged entirely on a single possession. An olive drab wool blanket, standard military issue, that had been given to him during his service in the early 90s. It was frayed at the edges and smelled of damp earth and diesel exhaust fumes, but it trapped body heat with the kind of efficiency that only military engineers understood. Wrapped inside it, cocooned against the concrete wall, Marcus was a fragile ember in a world of ice. Just past 2 in the morning, the rhythmic metallic screech of the trains overhead finally ceased, leaving the alley submerged in a suffocating, frozen silence. The city above had gone to sleep. Even the desperate and the damned had found somewhere warmer to wait out the killing cold. That silence was suddenly violently shattered. The deep, thunderous roar of a V-twin motorcycle engine tore through the frozen air like a chainsaw through silk. Marcus peeked out from the edge of his blanket, his breath fogging in the dim orange glow of a failing street lamp at the mouth of the alley. A massive custom-built Harley-Davidson chopper was skidding on a patch of black ice, the rear tire swinging wide as the rider fought for control. The engine sputtered, choked on the Arctic air, and died with a heavy metallic clank that echoed off the concrete walls. The rider slammed his boots onto the pavement to keep the heavy machine upright. Even in the poor light, Marcus could tell this wasn't someone you approached casually. The man was a mountain, easily 6'4", broad across the shoulders, in a way that suggested either a lifetime of hard labor or serious time in a prison yard weight room. He wore a thick denim vest over a black leather jacket, and on the back of that vest, unmistakable, even in the flickering amber light, were the curved red and white rockers and the winged death head insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Marcus watched as the biker kicked the stand down with more force than necessary and yanked off his heavy riding gloves, swearing loudly into the wind. The profanity was creative and continuous, the kind of cursing that came from genuine frustration rather than performance. The man dropped to one knee beside the engine, reaching under the fuel tank with bare hands, frantically trying to adjust what looked like a frozen petcock valve or a seized fuel line. But the Chicago cold was unforgiving, and it didn't care about desperation or mechanical knowledge. Within minutes, the biker's bare hands began to turn a sickly mottled purple. He was shivering violently now, his massive frame shaking against the side of the dead motorcycle. He wasn't wearing a winter coat, just a leather and denim, completely unprepared for a catastrophic breakdown in the middle of an Arctic freeze. From his cardboard shelter, Marcus calculated the odds with the kind of cold precision that had kept him alive in far worse places than Chicago. A man dressed like that in this kind of cold, exposed to the wind, had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia severely compromised his cognitive functions, maybe an hour before his organs started shutting down. Marcus knew the signs. He had seen men freeze in the mountains during the Gulf War, their lips turning blue, their movements becoming sluggish and confused, their eyes glazing over with the kind of confusion that came right before the body gave up entirely. His internal alarm screamed at him to stay hidden, to pull the blanket tighter, and wait for the biker to either fix his machine or call for help or freeze. It wasn't Marcus's problem. The Hells Angels fiercely protected their own, but their reputation with strangers, especially in dark abandoned alleys in the dead of night, was legendary and well-earned. Getting involved could mean getting hurt, or worse. But then Marcus watched the giant man drop a wrench because his fingers were too frozen to maintain a grip on the metal, and something shifted in his chest. A voice that sounded like it came from a younger, stronger version of himself echoed in the back of his mind. The Ranger Creed, words he'd memorized more than 30 years ago and had tried mostly unsuccessfully to live by ever since. Never leave a fallen comrade. He didn't know this man. He didn't know if the man was a criminal or a father or a monster, but he knew suffering when he saw it. He knew what it looked like when a human being was losing the fight against the elements. And he knew with absolute certainty that if he did nothing, he would wake up tomorrow morning, if he woke up at all, and find a frozen corpse 20 feet from where he slept. Marcus pushed himself up slowly, his joints protesting with sharp pains that reminded him he wasn't 27 anymore. The wind instantly bit into his thin, tattered jacket as he unwrapped the heavy wool blanket from his shoulders. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water. He walked slowly toward the biker, his boots crunching loudly on the ice to announce his presence, because you didn't sneak up on men like this if you wanted to survive the encounter. The biker spun around instantly, his hand dropping instinctively toward his waist. His face was hard and weathered, framed by a wild, ice-flecked beard that made him look like some kind of Viking warlord. His eyes were sharp and dangerous. "Back off, old man," he growled, his voice a gravelly rumble that somehow managed to cut through the wind. "I ain't in the mood, and you don't want this kind of trouble." Marcus stopped about 6 feet away. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He just held out the folded green blanket with both hands like an offering. "You're losing your core temperature," Marcus said, his voice raspy from disuse in the cold. "Your hands are already at stage 1 frost nip. Another 10 minutes working on that frozen steel with bare skin and you'll be losing fingers. Maybe the whole hand." The biker stared at him, really looked at him for the first time. His eyes moved from Marcus's face to the blanket, then back to Marcus's thin, shivering frame. Understanding dawned slowly, followed by something that might have been confusion or suspicion. "That's your only gear?" the biker said. It wasn't a question. His teeth were chattering uncontrollably, despite his attempt to maintain his tough exterior. "You give me that, you freeze. Don't bullshit me, old man. I can see you got nothing else." "I'm out of the wind back there." Marcus lied smoothly, gesturing toward his alcove with a small tilt of his head. "I got my spot. You're exposed out here. The wind's gonna kill you before that engine freezes solid. Take it. Wrap it around your chest and under your arms. It'll trap your body heat. Buy you time until help arrives." The biker hesitated. Pride battled with basic survival instinct, and for a moment Marcus thought the man might actually refuse. Then a brutal gust of wind swept through the alley with enough force to nearly knock them both off balance, and the decision was made. The biker snatched the blanket from Marcus's hands and immediately wrapped the heavy wool around his torso. The relief on his face was instantaneous and undeniable. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched slightly. He pulled the blanket tighter, his frozen fingers fumbling with the fabric. "Name's Garrett," the biker muttered, his voice slightly less hostile now. "Garrett Sloan." "Marcus." Garrett nodded toward the main road, his breath coming in visible clouds. "My wife's at St. Luke's Hospital. She went into labor 3 months early. I got the call at the clubhouse and just rode. Didn't grab my winter gear. Didn't think about the weather, didn't think about anything except getting there. Bike just gave out half a mile from the hospital." He looked down at Marcus with eyes that were clearer now, more focused. The blanket was already doing its work. "My brothers are coming with a truck and a trailer," Garrett continued. They're coming from the south side, so it's going to be at least an hour, maybe more with the roads like this. But they're coming. Marcus nodded slowly, crossing his arms and rubbing his own shoulders aggressively as the cold began to penetrate his bones with vicious efficiency. Keep it wrapped tight until they get here, Garrett. Don't take it off. Don't try to be tough. Just stay warm. Wait, Garrett said, reaching into his pocket with numb fingers. Let me give you some cash, something. I got I, Your fingers are too frozen to fish out a wallet, Marcus interrupted, turning away. And I don't need your money. Just keep that blanket wrapped tight and don't die out here. Your wife needs you. Your kid needs you. Marcus walked back to his alcove without waiting for a response. He lay down on the frozen cardboard, curling into the tightest fetal position his aging body would allow. He pulled his thin jacket over his head, trying to create some kind of insulation, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a paper cup. Without the blanket, the cold was no longer just an environment. It was a living entity, a predator. It tore at his skin with invisible claws and sank its teeth into his chest, making every breath painful. He tried to focus on his breathing, on keeping it slow and steady, but the shivering quickly became uncontrollable. Violent spasms racked his entire body, exhausting him, burning through what little energy he had left. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched into hours, hours compressed into moments. He couldn't tell anymore. Eventually, and this was the part that terrified him, even through the growing fog in his mind, the violent shivering stopped. He knew what that meant. He'd seen it before in other men, in other frozen places. When the body stopped shivering, it meant the core was shutting down. It meant the body was abandoning the extremities, sacrificing the fingers and toes and ears to protect the heart and brain for just a little while longer. A strange, deceptive warmth began to wash over him. It felt almost pleasant. The edges of his vision darkened not with shadow, but with a soft, welcoming darkness that promised rest. The howling wind began to sound distant, like ocean waves heard from very far away. Marcus thought about his daughter, Nora. Her name was Nora. He had to keep remembering that. The cold was making his thoughts slippery, hard to hold on to, but he couldn't forget her name. Not her. Nora would be 29 now, a grown woman. He wondered if she ever thought about him. Probably not. Probably better that way. He'd been a ghost to her for so long that his actual death wouldn't change much. Maybe she'd gotten married. Maybe she had kids of her own. Maybe she was happy. He hoped she was happy. A face appeared in the darkness. Not Nora's face, Eli's face. Corporal Elijah Brennan, young and grinning, despite the sand and the heat and the fear. Eli, who'd taken a bullet meant for someone else and spent 3 days bleeding out slowly while Marcus carried him across what felt like half of Kuwait. You saved the right man, brother. Eli's ghost said, his voice warm and clear despite the wind. You did good tonight. Marcus wanted to argue. Wanted to say that he hadn't saved anyone, that Garrett would probably be fine even without the blanket, that this was all just a stupid, pointless gesture that would accomplish nothing except killing a worthless, old homeless man. But he was too tired to argue with ghosts. I did a good thing, Marcus thought vaguely as his eyes drifted shut. The words felt important somehow, like they needed to be remembered. Not a bad way to clock out. He slipped into the darkness, expecting never to wake up, hoping in a distant corner of his fading consciousness that Nora had found a better life than the one he'd given her. Hoping that Garrett made it to the hospital in time. Hoping that the blanket kept him warm enough. Hoping. The darkness took him gently, like a parent putting a child to bed. The first sensation wasn't cold. It was smell. Bacon grease, strong and unmistakable. Black coffee, the cheap diner kind that was more caffeine than flavor. And underneath it all, the sharp chemical scent of pine sol, so strong, it almost burned his nostrils. Marcus's eyes snapped open. He gasped, sucking in a lungful of warm, dry air that felt so alien after the frozen night that for a moment he thought he might be hallucinating. He threw his hands out instinctively, expecting to hit the icy concrete wall of the overpass, expecting the rough texture of frozen cardboard. Instead, his knuckles sank into something impossibly soft. He blinked against bright, unfiltered sunlight streaming through a window. Not the weak gray light of a Chicago winter morning filtered through clouds and elevated train tracks. Real sunlight, strong and warm. He was lying in a bed, a massive king-size bed with a real mattress and a box spring buried under a heavy down-filled quilt that must have cost more than everything Marcus had owned in the last 5 years combined. The sheets smelled like fresh laundry detergent, the kind advertised on television. The walls were painted a warm, muted gray professional and clean. A ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, pushing gentle waves of heated air down from a baseboard radiator. Panic seized him with claws sharper than the cold had been. Was he dead? Was this some kind of afterlife? Was this a VA hospital room? Had someone found him and called an ambulance? He threw off the quilt and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his body protesting every movement. He was wearing a clean gray sweatsuit that definitely didn't belong to him. His boots, cleaned and polished to a shine he hadn't seen in years, sat neatly at the foot of the bed. He stood up, his joints crackling and popping like fireworks, but he was alive. He could feel his toes, all 10 of them. No frostbite, no blackened flesh. His fingers worked. His ears didn't burn with the telltale signs of tissue damage. Somehow impossibly, he was alive. He walked out of the bedroom on unsteady legs and found himself in a hallway with polished hardwood floors that gleamed in the morning light. The house felt substantial, solid, the kind of place built by people who expected it to last for generations. He could hear voices coming from somewhere ahead, low and masculine, punctuated by occasional laughter. Following the smell of coffee and the sound of conversation, Marcus walked into a massive open-concept kitchen that looked like something from a home improvement show. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a huge island in the center made of heavy oak that could seat 8 people comfortably. Sitting around that island were 4 men. They were all massive, wearing various iterations of leather cuts and denim vests, every single one of them adorned with the Hells Angels death head. The kitchen counter was covered with motorcycle parts, a disassembled carburetor sitting in a pool of oil next to a pot of coffee and a platter of eggs and bacon. One of the men turned around. It was Garrett. His beard was no longer covered in ice, and the grim, desperate look from the alley was gone, replaced by a wide, easy grin that transformed his entire face. "Sleeping Beauty rises," Garrett boomed, his voice filling the kitchen. "Pour him a cup, Kevin. Man looks like he could use it." An older biker with silver hair and a face marked by deep scars that looked like they had stories behind them grabbed a heavy ceramic mug, filled it with black coffee from a commercial-grade pot, and slid it across the island toward Marcus. Marcus stepped forward tentatively, his mind still trying to catch up with his circumstances. He grabbed the mug, and the heat radiating into his palms was the greatest sensation he could remember experiencing in recent memory. He wrapped both hands around it and just stood there, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. "Where am I?" Marcus asked, his voice still rough. "How did I get here?" Garrett leaned back against the counter, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "When my brothers finally showed up with the trailer last night, we loaded up my bike. Took us maybe 20 minutes to get the chains on and secure it. I walked back into that alcove to return your blanket and found you." He paused and his expression grew serious. "You were blue, Marcus. Actually blue. Unresponsive. I couldn't find a pulse, but maybe that was just because my hands were still half frozen. We threw you in the back of the truck, got some emergency blankets on. You cranked the heat up as high as it would go." The older biker with the silver hair spoke up. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel being poured into a metal drum. "We almost took you to the emergency room, but we got our own medical guy at the clubhouse. Kevin used to be a trauma medic in the Army. Saw some serious shit in Iraq. He said your core temperature was critical, but the hospitals would just stabilize you and throw you back on the street in 3 days once they realized you didn't have insurance or a permanent address. We don't do that to people, especially not to brothers." Kevin, presumably the medic, nodded from his position at the island. He was younger than the silver-haired man, maybe in his mid-40s, with the kind of calm, assessing eyes that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies. "I put you in a heated saline bath, slowly brought your core temperature back up while monitoring your vitals, pumped you full of warm fluids intravenously, kept watch until you stabilize. Then we brought you here." "Here?" Marcus asked, looking around the pristine kitchen with growing confusion. "Where is here exactly?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his leather vest and pulled out Marcus's battered leather wallet, the one that had been in his jacket pocket. He tossed it onto the counter in front of Marcus. "We had to go through your pockets," Garrett explained, his tone apologetic. "We needed to find out who you were. See if you had any medical allergies, any next of kin. We should contact anything that might help Kevin keep you alive." Garrett flipped the wallet open with practiced ease. He pulled out a faded, dog-eared Polaroid photograph that had been tucked behind Marcus's expired driver's license, protected by a small plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. The photograph was from 1991. Two young men in desert camouflage, their faces darkened by sun and sand, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning fiercely at the camera, despite the exhaustion visible in their eyes. One of them was Marcus, barely recognizable under the youth and the military haircut and the confidence that came from being 27 and invincible. The other was his spotter, his brother, in everything but blood. "You didn't mention you were a ranger," Garrett said softly, and something in his tone made the entire atmosphere in the kitchen shift. The boisterous, intimidating biker energy that had filled the room just moments before evaporated completely, replaced by something heavier, something solemn and respectful. The silver-haired biker stood up slowly from his stool and walked around the kitchen island until he was standing directly in front of Marcus. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he was used to being in charge. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, studied Marcus's face with an intensity that made Marcus want to look away. Marcus took a sip of coffee to buy himself time to give his hands something to do. "It doesn't come up much in my current line of work," he said finally, his attempt at humor falling flat in the heavy silence. Garrett pointed at the other man in the Polaroid, the one with the wide smile and the bright eyes and the future that had been cut short in a hospital bed thousands of miles from the desert that had wounded him. "That your spotter?" Garrett asked. Marcus swallowed hard. Even after 34 years, the memory of Corporal Elijah Brennan still had the power to crush his chest and make breathing difficult. "Eli. His name was Eli Brennan. He was my spotter, my brother, and the best man I ever knew. He didn't make it back home. Not really." The silver-haired biker reached out and took the photograph from Garrett's hands with surprising gentleness. He stared at it for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he looked up at Marcus, his pale eyes were glistening. "I know he didn't make it," the silver-haired biker said, his voice cracking slightly, despite his obvious attempt to keep it steady. "Eli was my baby brother." Marcus froze. The coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at the silver-haired man's face, really looked at it for the first time, and suddenly saw the resemblance. The jawline, the slope of the nose, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. Features that had been smoothed by youth in Eli's face, but had been carved into hard lines by age and experience in his brother's. "Warren," Marcus whispered, the name coming from a memory, 34 years old. "Warren Brennan." The silver-haired biker nodded once, sharp and controlled, like he was trying to keep himself together through sheer force of will. "Most people call me War these days. Have for about 20 years now." Garrett put a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion barely held in check. "War is my uncle. Eli was my uncle too, though I never got to meet him. He died before I was born, but I grew up hearing stories about him, about his sacrifice, about the ranger who carried him 15 miles through enemy territory to get him to a medic." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was even rougher. "You shared your absolute last source of warmth with me last night, the only thing keeping you alive in that frozen alley. You gave it to a complete stranger and then laid down on the concrete expecting to die so that I could live long enough to get to my newborn daughter." Garrett's grip on Marcus's shoulder tightened. "You did all that without even knowing you were giving that blanket to the nephew of the man whose life you saved 34 years ago." The silence in the kitchen was profound. The weight of fate, of circles closing after more than 3 decades, hung in the air like something physical. Marcus could feel it pressing down on him, making the room feel smaller despite its size. War reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy set of brass keys attached to a leather Hells Angels keychain. He placed them on the counter directly in front of Marcus with a solid click that seemed to echo louder than it should have. "This house," War said quietly, his deep voice carefully controlled. "The charter bought it at a bank auction 3 days ago. It was a foreclosure. Some predatory lending company seized it from a woman who couldn't make her payments, then flipped it to the bank to liquidate the asset. We were planning to fix it up and sell it, use the cash for our legal defense fund." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like it might be hope. "But we had a sit down this morning," War continued. "A full patch vote, every member of the charter. We told them what happened last night. We told them about Eli. We told them about you." Garrett smiled, and it was the kind of smile that transformed his entire intimidating presence into something warm and genuine. It was unanimous, Marcus. You don't sleep on concrete anymore. The deed is being transferred to your name this afternoon. The property taxes are paid up for the next 10 years. This house is yours, free and clear. Marcus stared at the keys. His hands began to shake, and it had nothing to do with the cold this time. A house. An actual house with walls and heat and running water. After a decade of fighting for scraps of cardboard, of fighting off territorial disputes with other homeless men, of being treated like invisible trash by a city that had forgotten he existed. I can't, Marcus stammered, stepping back from the counter like the keys might burn him. I can't take this. I can't. It's too much. You guys don't owe me a house for a blanket. That's insane. I just gave you a blanket. That's all, just a blanket. We don't owe you for the blanket, War said firmly, stepping forward and taking Marcus's hand. He pressed the keys into Marcus's palm and closed his fingers around them. We owe you for Eli. We owe you for carrying my baby brother home when you could have left him. We owe you for Garrett's life last night. For my great niece Emma, who's alive and healthy right now because you didn't let her father freeze to death in an alley. His grip tightened, and his pale eyes locked onto Marcus's with an intensity that made looking away impossible. In our world, Marcus, you pay your debts in full. You don't leave things unfinished, and you take care of family. War's voice dropped even lower. You are family now, whether you like it or not. End of discussion. Marcus looked down at the brass keys in his palm. They felt impossibly heavy. A tear finally broke free from the corner of his eye, tracing a clean line down his weathered, scarred cheek. He had a home. He actually had a home. After 10 years of cold concrete and frozen nights and being invisible to everyone who mattered, he had a place that belonged to him. There's one thing, though, Garrett said, and his tone suddenly shifted from warm to businesslike. The temperature in the room seemed to dial back, replaced by a sharp, tense edge that made Marcus look up. What? Marcus asked, wiping his face quickly with the back of his hand. Garrett pulled something else out of Marcus's wallet. Another piece of paper, this one more crumpled and yellowed than the photograph. It was an envelope, the kind you sent letters in. The address was written in feminine handwriting that Marcus recognized immediately, and across the front, stamped in red ink, were two words that had haunted him for 10 years. Return to sender. The addressee was listed as Nora Callahan. We ran the address on this envelope through a private investigator we use for background checks, Garrett said, leaning against the counter. His expression was serious now, all traces of warmth gone. Marcus, this house we bought from the bank. We didn't just pick it at random out of a list of foreclosures. War stepped closer, and his voice was gentle despite the devastating information he was about to deliver. Our PI found out who the bank foreclosed this property from. Found out who used to live here before the predatory loan company seized it. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the yellowed envelope, at Nora's name, written in his own handwriting from a decade ago, and suddenly the warm kitchen felt like it was tilting sideways. Nora, War confirmed softly, watching Marcus's face carefully. Your daughter. She owned this house, Marcus. The bank took it from her 2 months ago. She was evicted. Garrett's eyes hardened, and when he spoke next, his voice carried the kind of cold fury that suggested this was personal for him now. She's out there on the streets right now, Marcus, just like you were last night. And we didn't just bring you here to give you a place to sleep. He straightened up, and despite his size, there was something almost gentle in the way he looked at Marcus. We brought you here because this is her home, Garrett said, and we're going to help you tear this city apart until we find her and bring her back to it. Within 20 minutes, the quiet suburban street outside the house was transformed into something that looked like a military staging area. 15 massive custom Harley-Davidson motorcycles idled in the driveway, and along the curb, their V-twin engines creating a synchronized thunderous rhythm that rattled the windows of neighboring houses and set off car alarms 3 blocks away. The men riding them were hardened and scarred, clad in heavy winter riding gear worn over their death's head patches. Every single one of them knew why they were there, and every single one of them looked ready to tear the city apart with their bare hands if necessary. Marcus walked out the front door wearing a heavy insulated Carhartt jacket that War had pulled from a storage closet, along with thermal boots that actually fit and insulated gloves that were lined with fleece. Garrett was waiting beside his massive road glide, The same bike that had broken down in the alley the night before, now repaired and rumbling like a caged animal. "You ever ridden before?" Garrett asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not since the Army, and that was mostly transport trucks." "Then hold on tight and lean when I lean. Don't fight the bike. Just move with it." Garrett threw one leg over the machine and gestured to the seat behind him. "Ready?" Marcus climbed on his body, protesting the unfamiliar position, and wrapped his arms around Garrett's midsection. "Ready." "Good." Garrett revved the engine, and the sound was like controlled thunder. "Because we're about to show you what a real search and rescue operation looks like." They hit the streets like an invading army. The convoy of 15 Harleys moved through Chicago with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested these men had done this before. They didn't bother with police reports or official channels or waiting for the system to care about one more homeless person lost in the winter cold. They went directly to the arteries of the city's underbelly, to the places where the forgotten people gathered to survive. Marcus had lived on these streets for 10 years, and he knew them well. But what he witnessed over the next 6 hours was something different entirely. The Hells Angels didn't conduct a search. They executed a tactical sweep, and they had resources that Marcus couldn't have imagined. Their first stop was Lower Wacker Drive, the subterranean street that ran beneath the main downtown area. Down there, beneath the gleaming towers of commerce and wealth, a different city existed. A tent city made of tarps and shopping carts and cardboard, where hundreds of people lived in the shadows because they had nowhere else to go. The rumble of 15 Harleys echoing through the concrete tunnel brought people out of their shelters. They emerged cautiously, suspiciously, because nothing good ever arrived on motorcycles. But War climbed off his bike and walked straight toward a cluster of older men gathered around a burning trash barrel, and he called out a name that made several of them turn around. "Carlos, I need a word, brother." A man in his 50s wearing layers of torn jackets and a wool hat that had seen better decades stepped forward. He recognized War immediately, and something that looked almost like relief crossed his weathered face. "War, didn't expect to see you down here." "I'm looking for someone," War said, pulling out a photograph. It was a picture of Nora, one that the private investigator had pulled from her social media before she'd stopped posting 2 months ago. "Her name is Nora Callahan. She's been on the streets for about 2 months. You've seen her." Carlos took the photo and studied it carefully. Behind War, Marcus waited, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it felt like it might crack them. This was the first lead, the first chance. "I ain't seen her," Carlos said finally, and Marcus felt his heart sink. But then Carlos turned and called out to the gathered crowd. "Any of you seen this girl? She's missing. Her people are looking for her." Several people approached, took the photo, shook their heads, passed it along. Then a woman, maybe in her 30s but aged beyond her years by hard living, stepped forward. "I seen her. Maybe a week ago. She was at the soup kitchen on Halsted, the one run by the church. She looked bad, man. Real skinny, scared. Kept looking over her shoulder like someone was hunting her." War reached into his vest and pulled out a roll of cash. He peeled off $500 bills and handed them to Carlos. "You hear anything, you call me. Anyone here sees her, they call me immediately. There's more where that came from for information that helps us find her." Carlos took the money with a nod of respect. "Ghost helped me out once," he said, looking past War to where Marcus stood beside the bikes. "Gave me his last meal when I was starving. I owe him. We'll keep our eyes open." They moved to the next location, the West Side Women's Shelter, a converted church basement that provided temporary housing for women fleeing domestic violence. War's imposing presence and leather vest made the volunteers nervous, until he explained why they were there, and then their expressions shifted from suspicion to concern. The director, a middle-aged woman named Patricia with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd seen decades of hard work, led them to her office and pulled out the guest ledger. "We keep records of everyone who stays here, even if it's just for one night. Privacy laws mean I can't share this normally, but if she's in danger..." She ran her finger down pages of names, dates, check-in times. "Nora Callahan, she was here 3 weeks ago, stayed for 2 nights, left on the 3rd morning. She seemed terrified, wouldn't tell us what she was running from, but she had bruises on her wrists, fresh ones, like someone had grabbed her hard." Marcus stepped forward, his voice tight. "Did she say anything? Anything about where she might go?" Patricia shook her head sadly. "She asked about legal aid, asked if we knew any lawyers who could help with predatory lending cases. I gave her a few phone numbers, but I don't know if she ever called them. A lot of people who come through here are dealing with situations that are beyond what free legal aid can fix. Garrett handed Patricia a card with a phone number written on it. She comes back, you call this number immediately. Day or night, we'll come get her. They continued the sweep, soup kitchens, overnight shelters, the known encampments beneath overpasses and in abandoned buildings. At each location, War or Garrett would flash the photograph, ask questions, hand out cash and phone numbers. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. Nora had been moving, constantly moving, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. She was running from something or someone. Multiple people mentioned that she looked scared, that she kept to herself, that she'd asked about places that were safe from him, without ever specifying who him was. But Marcus knew. He'd heard the name from War that morning. Derek Lawson, the predatory lender who had taken Nora's home and apparently wasn't content to leave it at that. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, icy shadows across the concrete jungle, the encrypted radio clipped to Garrett's jacket crackled to life. A voice came through, rough with static, but clear enough to understand. Garrett, it's Iron Mike. I'm down at a soup kitchen in Pilsen, little place called Maria's Kitchen. The volunteer here recognized the photo, said a girl matching Nora's description has been coming in for the past week. She's in bad shape, coughing, looking sick. The volunteer said she saw Nora leave here yesterday, heading toward an abandoned motel on the edge of the industrial district near Cicero, the old Starlight Inn. Garrett's entire body went rigid. He looked at War, and something passed between them. Some kind of understanding that didn't require words. We're on our way, Garrett said into the radio. Then he turned to Marcus, and his expression was grim. The Starlight Inn isn't just abandoned. It's a known haven for the worst kind of people. Drug dealers, human traffickers, men who prey on desperate women. It's no place for anyone, let alone someone like Nora. Marcus felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Not fear, something older and more dangerous than fear. How fast can we get there? 10 minutes if we push it. Garrett swung his leg over the bike. Get on, and hold tight because we're not obeying traffic laws. The ride to the Starlight Inn was a blur of wind and speed, and the roar of engines pushed to their limits. Garrett weaved through traffic with the kind of reckless precision that suggested he'd done this before, and the other 14 bikes followed in tight formation. They ran red lights. They used the shoulder when the lanes were blocked. They made cars swerve and pedestrians scatter, and they didn't slow down. Marcus held on and tried not to think about what they might find when they got there. Tried not to imagine his daughter sick and scared, trapped in some hellhole with predators circling. Tried not to let the rage building in his chest consume him entirely, because he needed to be focused, needed to be sharp, needed to be the ranger he used to be, not the broken homeless man he'd become. The Starlight Inn appeared like something out of a nightmare. It was a decaying U-shaped structure made of cinder blocks that had once been painted white, but were now stained with decades of pollution and neglect. The neon sign that had probably once spelled out the motel's name was collapsed and broken, lying in pieces in the overgrown parking lot. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood, and the few that weren't boarded were shattered completely. The parking lot was a graveyard of stripped, rusted cars and broken glass that crunched under the tires of the motorcycles. The desolate silence of the industrial park was violently broken as Garrett War and 13 other Hells Angels roared into the lot. They didn't park neatly. They formed a tactical barricade blocking the only exit to the street. Kickstands slammed down in unison, the sound echoing off the concrete like the cocking of shotguns. Engines cut off one by one, leaving only the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of boots hitting pavement. Marcus was off the back of Garrett's bike before the engine fully died. He sprinted toward the main office building, his eyes scanning the dilapidated doors, looking for any sign of life or movement. Spread out. War commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made men move without question. Kick every door, check every room. We're looking for a 29-year-old woman, dark hair, probably scared. If you find her, you radio immediately. If you find anyone giving her trouble, you handle it, and then you radio. Go. The bikers fanned out like a SWAT team executing a raid. Heavy boots shattered rotted wooden doors with single kicks. Startled squatters scattered like roaches from the sudden influx of heavily built, leather-clad giants invading their sanctuary. Most ran without question, grabbing whatever possessions they could carry, and disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings that surrounded the motel. Marcus ran down the left wing of the motel, his ranger training flooding back after decades of dormancy. He cleared corners, instinctively checked sightlines, moved with purpose. As he passed room 114, he heard it. A muffled shout, distinctly feminine, followed by the sound of breaking glass. He didn't hesitate, didn't call for backup, didn't announce himself. The old instincts took over completely. Marcus stepped back, raised his right leg, and drove the heel of his heavy boot squarely into the door just beside the lock. The rotted wood splintered like kindling. The entire door blew completely off its hinges and crashed into the room, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. Inside, the air was freezing and smelled of mildew and human desperation. A man in an expensive suit, completely out of place in the squalor, was cornering a young woman against the far wall. Two larger men, obvious muscle for hire, were standing near the broken window, blocking any escape route. The woman turned at the sound of the door exploding inward, and Marcus's entire world stopped. It was Nora, his daughter, but she looked nothing like the 19-year-old girl he'd left behind. She was painfully thin, her cheekbones sharp and pronounced beneath skin that was too pale. Her dark hair was matted and tangled. She wore a thin, torn sweater that wouldn't have kept anyone warm even in summer, and her arms were covered in bruises. Fresh ones and old ones layered like a map of suffering. But her eyes were the same dark brown that had belonged to her mother, filled now with fear and exhaustion, and something that looked like it might be defiance fighting against the weight of despair. "I told you, Nora," the man in the suit sneered, seemingly unbothered by the door that had just been kicked in. "You still owe the penalty fees, $57,000 in accumulated interest and late charges. You think because they foreclosed, you're off the hook. You work for me now. You work until it's paid in full, or things get much worse for you. Do you understand?" He reached out to grab her arm, and that's when Marcus stepped fully into the room. His presence filled the doorway like a shadow made solid. "Don't," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, cold, the kind of quiet that was more dangerous than shouting. "Don't touch her." The two thugs near the window turned their hands, reaching inside their jackets instinctively. But before they could draw whatever weapons they were reaching for, heavy footsteps sounded behind Marcus, and Garrett stepped into the doorway. He had to duck his massive frame to clear the entrance. Behind him stood War and a biker Marcus had heard called Iron Mike, their hands resting casually on heavy metal flashlights clipped to their belts. The sheer, overwhelming physical menace of the three Hells Angels entering the small room sucked the oxygen out of the space. The two thugs froze, their hands slowly pulling away from their jackets. Their eyes moved from the bikers to their employer, and a silent calculation happened. Whatever they were being paid, it wasn't enough to die in a frozen motel room, fighting three men who looked like they'd been born for violence. The man in the suit backed up a step, but he tried to maintain his composure, tried to project the authority of someone used to getting his way through intimidation and legal manipulation. "Who the hell are you people? This is a private business matter. You have no right." "Derek Lawson, I presume," War said, stepping past Marcus with deliberate slowness. He walked toward the man in the suit like a predator approaching cornered prey. "You have a nasty habit of stealing homes from vulnerable people. We've been learning all about you today." Lawson backed up another step, and now the arrogance was starting to crack. "I don't know what she told you, but everything I did was legal. The loan was structured properly. The foreclosure followed all state regulations. This is a simple debt collection." "Not anymore," Garrett growled. He crossed the room in two long strides and grabbed Lawson by the lapels of his expensive coat, lifting him an inch off the floor with seemingly no effort. "The house belongs to our club now. We bought it from the bank, and the girl belongs to him." Garrett nodded toward Marcus, who still stood near the doorway, unable to move, unable to look away from his daughter. Nora, trembling violently in her thin sweater, finally looked past the giant bikers. Her eyes locked onto the weathered, scarred face of the older man standing in the shattered doorway. Recognition came slowly, like someone trying to remember a dream from long ago. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly. "Dad," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. Marcus broke. Everything he'd been holding together for the past 10 years, all the carefully constructed walls he'd built to protect himself from feeling too much, from caring too much, from hoping too much, they all crumbled to dust. He crossed the room in two strides and pulled his daughter into his arms. She was freezing, Her entire body was shaking, whether from the cold or fear or shock, he couldn't tell. She felt fragile in his arms, like she might break if he held her too tight, but he couldn't make himself let go. He buried his face in her matted hair and felt tears he didn't know he still had the capacity to produce streaming down his face. "I've got you," Marcus sobbed, his voice breaking completely. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I left. I'm never leaving again. I've got you. I've got you." Nora clung to him, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket, like he might disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. She was weeping openly now, her entire body shaking with the force of it. "I thought you were dead," she cried against his chest. "I thought you were dead. I lost the house, Dad. I lost everything. Mom's gone. The house is gone. I have nothing left, nothing." "No," Marcus whispered fiercely, pulling back just enough to look at her face. He cupped her cheeks with both hands, his thumbs wiping away tears, even as his own continued to fall. "You didn't lose everything. You have me, and we're going home." Behind them, War stepped closer to Lawson, who was still dangling from Garrett's grip like a scarecrow. War pulled a folded legal document from inside his vest, the paper crisp and official looking. "This is a full release of liability and a complete forgiveness of all outstanding debts, real or fabricated, owed by Nora Callahan. You are going to sign it right now using that wall as a desk." He produced a pen and held it out. "And then you are going to leave this city. If I ever hear your name again, if I ever see your shadow near this family, if you even think about coming back, we won't be having a conversation. We'll be having a very different kind of interaction. Do you understand me?" Lawson, pale and shaking, nodded frantically. Garrett dropped him, and the man hastily scribbled his signature on the document using the stained wall as support. His hand was shaking so badly the signature was barely legible, but it was there, legal and binding. The moment he finished signing, Lawson and his two thugs bolted past the bikers, scrambling through the broken door and disappearing into the frozen dusk. The sound of a car engine starting and tires screeching on pavement echoed from the parking lot, and then they were gone. Garrett turned to Marcus and Nora. His fearsome demeanor had entirely vanished, replaced by something gentle and almost paternal. He unclipped his own heavy leather and fleece-lined riding jacket and draped it over Nora's trembling shoulders. It was so large on her that it hung almost to her knees. "Come on, little sister," Garrett said gently. "Let's get you out of the cold. You've got a kitchen waiting for you with hot food and clean clothes, and a bed that actually has blankets, real ones." Nora looked up at him, confusion and disbelief warring on her face. "I don't understand. Who are you people? Why are you helping me?" Marcus tightened his arm around her shoulders. "It's a long story, sweetheart, but the short version is that these men are family, and family takes care of family." An hour later, they were back in the warm, brightly lit kitchen of the house that had once been Nora's, and was now somehow hers again. She had taken a long, hot shower, the kind she probably hadn't experienced in 2 months. She emerged wearing an oversized sweatshirt that one of the bikers had provided, her hair wet, but clean, her face scrubbed. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks, replacing the deathly pallor that had terrified Marcus when he first saw her in that motel room. She sat at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea that steamed in the air between them. Marcus sat beside her, and he hadn't let go of her hand since they'd gotten back. He kept touching her arm, her shoulder, her hand, like he needed the physical contact to believe she was real and not some cruel hallucination. War had made food, simple food, eggs and toast and bacon, but Nora ate like she hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks, which Marcus realized with a sickening jolt was probably accurate. The other bikers had tactfully made themselves scarce, giving the father and daughter space, but remaining close enough to help if needed. Garrett was on the porch smoking a cigarette and making phone calls. War was in the living room, giving them privacy but maintaining a protective presence. Nora set down her mug and looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time since the initial shock of seeing him had worn off. Her eyes traced the lines on his face, the gray in his beard, the scars that hadn't been there 10 years ago. "Where were you?" she asked, and her voice was quiet but not gentle. There was steel underneath the exhaustion. 10 years, Dad. 10 years. Where were you when Mom got sick? Where were you when she died? Where were you when I lost the house, when I ended up on the streets?" Marcus flinched like she'd struck him, but he didn't look away. He owed her this. Owed her the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I was on the streets too, different streets, different places, but the same kind of hell you were in. I've been homeless for 10 years, Nora. She stared at him and he watched the anger in her eyes shift to confusion. What? But why you just left? You left me and Mom and you just disappeared. I thought you didn't care. I thought you'd started a new life somewhere and didn't want us anymore. No, Marcus said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. God, no, that's not why I left. I left because I was dangerous. Because the war followed me home and made me into something I couldn't control. He took a shaky breath and told her. Told her about the night terrors that got progressively worse. Told her about the flashbacks that made him violent and unpredictable. And finally, he told her about the night he woke up with his hands around her throat, the night that made the decision for him. You were 19 years old, Marcus said, his voice breaking. You tried to wake me from a nightmare, and I attacked you. I slammed you against the wall and started choking you before I even knew what I was doing. When I finally came back to myself and saw the terror in your eyes, saw the bruises forming on your neck, I knew I couldn't stay. I was going to kill you, Nora. Maybe not that night, maybe not intentionally, but eventually in one of those episodes, I was going to hurt you badly or worse. So I left. I disappeared. I convinced myself you'd be safer without me. Nora's hand went to her throat unconsciously and her eyes were distant, like she was trying to remember something from long ago. I remember that night, she whispered. I remember waking up on the floor, my throat hurt. You were gone. I didn't understand what happened. Mom said you'd had a nightmare, that you didn't mean it. She looked at him, and tears were streaming down her face now. You left to protect me. I left because I was a coward, Marcus said. I told myself it was to protect you, but the truth is I was terrified. Terrified of what I might do. Terrified of being a burden. Terrified of watching you look at me with fear instead of love. So I ran, and I've regretted it every single day since. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 10 years of absence pressing down on both of them. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said, and the words cut through Marcus like a knife. I'm not ready to just pretend the last 10 years didn't happen. Marcus nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But, Nora continued, and she squeezed his hand tighter. I'm glad you're here now. I'm glad you're alive, and I'm glad you found me. Marcus looked at his daughter, and something that might have been hope flickered in his chest. I'm here now, Nora, and I'm not going anywhere, not ever again. I know I can't undo the past 10 years, but I can be here for whatever comes next, if you'll let me. Nora was quiet for a moment, studying his face. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, but you have to promise me something. Anything. You have to actually stay this time. No more running, no more disappearing. If things get hard, if the nightmares come back, if you're struggling, you stay and we figure it out together. Promise me. I promise, Marcus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. I'm not going anywhere, Nora. You're stuck with me now. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. We'll see how long you last before my stubbornness drives you crazy. I've been living on the streets for 10 years, Marcus said, and this time he managed something that might have been a smile too. I can handle stubborn. That night, Nora went to her old bedroom, the one that had been hers before the foreclosure, and she locked the door. Marcus didn't take it personally. He understood. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in a single conversation, no matter how emotional. He settled on the couch in the living room, wrapped in a spare blanket that War had provided. He was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with emotional overload. But sleep didn't come easily. The moment he closed his eyes, the nightmares were waiting. Eli Brennan's face covered in sand and blood, the sound of gunfire, the weight of a dying man on his back as he stumbled through the desert. And then newer nightmares, images of Nora freezing in that motel room, of arriving too late, of finding her dead instead of alive. He woke up screaming, thrashing against invisible enemies, and it took several seconds for him to remember where he was. The living room, the house, safe. He heard a door open upstairs, footsteps on the stairs. He expected Nora to call down to ask if he was okay, maybe to tell him to keep it down. Instead, she appeared in the doorway of the living room wearing the oversized sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants, her hair tangled from sleep. She didn't say anything. She just walked over to the couch, picked up the blanket that had fallen to the floor during his nightmare, and draped it back over him. Her movements were gentle, careful. "You're not alone anymore, Dad," she whispered so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "The nightmares are still there, but you're not alone in them." Then she turned and walked back upstairs. But this time Marcus heard it clearly. She didn't lock her bedroom door. It was a small thing, a tiny gesture. But in that moment, it felt like forgiveness might actually be possible. Not today, maybe not even soon, but someday. Marcus pulled the blanket tight and closed his eyes, and when the nightmares came again, they felt just a little less overwhelming than before. The next morning, Marcus woke to the smell of burnt toast. For a moment, disoriented by actual sleep and the unfamiliar softness of the couch, he thought he was dreaming. Then he heard the sound of someone cursing softly in the kitchen, followed by the scrape of a knife against charred bread, and he smiled despite himself. He found Nora in the kitchen, standing in front of the toaster with a determined expression on her face and 2 pieces of blackened bread on a plate in front of her. She looked up when he entered, and something that might have been embarrassment crossed her features. "I forgot how temperamental this toaster is," she said, gesturing at the smoking appliance. "It used to burn everything on setting 3, but that was the only setting that would actually toast the bread instead of just warming it." Marcus walked over and looked at the toaster, then at the burnt toast, then at his daughter. And then for the first time in what felt like years, he laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed and rough but genuine. "You always burnt the toast," he said, the memory coming back with unexpected clarity. "Even when you were 12, your mom used to joke that we should just buy pre-burnt bread and save you the trouble." Nora's expression softened, and she laughed too, though hers was tinged with sadness. "I remember that. She used to say I had a gift for culinary destruction." They stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of burnt toast and the ghost of a woman they'd both loved, and for a moment the weight of the past 10 years felt just a little lighter. "I'll make breakfast," Marcus offered, "if you don't mind eating scrambled eggs that are probably going to be overcooked." "You always overcook the eggs too," Nora said, but she was smiling now. Some things never change. They ate together at the kitchen island, the eggs predictably rubbery, and the toast beyond saving, but neither of them complained. They talked about small things: the weather, the house, the neighborhood that Nora vaguely remembered from before the foreclosure. They carefully avoided the big topics, the painful ones, content for now, to exist in this fragile piece. War arrived around mid-morning, carrying a stack of legal documents and wearing an expression that suggested he'd been up most of the night working on something. He spread the papers across the kitchen island while Marcus poured him coffee. "The deed transfer is complete," War said, pointing to the top document. "As of 8 this morning, this house is officially registered to Nora Callahan. Free and clear, no liens, no outstanding debts, property taxes paid for the next decade." Nora stared at the document, her hand hovering over it like she was afraid it might disappear if she touched it. "I don't understand. How is this possible? The bank foreclosed. Lawson took everything. How can it just be mine again?" "Because we bought it from the bank," War explained patiently, "and we're transferring ownership to you. The charter voted on it. Unanimous decision. This is your home, Nora. It always was. Some predatory vulture stole it from you, but we're giving it back." "But why?" Nora asked, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You don't even know me. Why would you do this?" War looked at Marcus, then back at Nora. "Your father saved my brother's life 34 years ago. Carried him out of a combat zone when he could have left him behind. Eli died anyway, but he got to say goodbye to our family because of what your dad did. And then 2 nights ago, your father gave his only source of warmth to my nephew, expecting to freeze to death himself so that Garrett could live long enough to see his newborn daughter." He paused, his pale eyes intense. "In our world, debts like that don't go unpaid. You're family now, whether you understand it or not, and family takes care of family." Nora looked at her father, seeing him perhaps for the first time not as the man who abandoned her, but as someone who had lived an entire life she knew nothing about. Someone who had saved lives and made impossible choices and suffered in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "Thank you," she whispered, and she wasn't entirely sure if she was talking to War or to her father or to both of them. The first week passed in a strange, tentative rhythm. Nora was wary, keeping emotional distance, even as she and Marcus shared the same space. She would sit at one end of the couch while he sat at the other. She would make her own meals and eat them in her room. She would say good morning and good night, but the conversations rarely went deeper than surface pleasantries. Marcus didn't push. He understood that trust was something that had to be rebuilt, slowly earned through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. So he focused on the small things. He made sure there was always fresh coffee in the morning. He bought groceries and stocked the refrigerator with food. He remembered she used to like hoping her taste hadn't changed too much in 10 years. He fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom and the loose hinge on the front door. He was there, present, visible, trying to prove through actions what his words alone couldn't convey. War helped Nora apply for jobs, leveraging his connections in ways that surprised her. Within a week, she had an interview at the auto garage that the Hells Angels used for their legitimate business operations. They needed a bookkeeper, someone good with numbers and comfortable, working in an environment that was rough around the edges. The morning of her interview, Marcus offered to drive her. She hesitated, then accepted. They drove in silence for most of the trip, the radio filling the space between them with classic rock that neither of them really listened to. "I'm nervous," Nora admitted as they pulled into the garage's parking lot. "I haven't worked in 2 months. I probably look like hell. They're going to think I'm not qualified." "You're qualified," Marcus said firmly. "You managed your mother's care, handled a household budget, dealt with predatory lenders and medical billing departments. You survived 2 months on the streets. If you can do all that, you can handle bookkeeping for a garage." She looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. "You really believe that?" "I know it," Marcus said. "You're stronger than you think, Nora. You always have been. You got that from your mother." "And the stubbornness?" she asked, and there was the ghost of a smile on her lips. "That you got from me," Marcus admitted. "For better or worse." She got the job, started the following Monday, and when Marcus picked her up after her first day, she was actually smiling. "How was it?" he asked. "Chaotic," she said. "The previous bookkeeper apparently didn't believe in filing systems or digital records. Everything's on paper scattered across 3 different offices. It's going to take me weeks to organize it all. But you can do it." "I can do it," she confirmed, and then almost shyly she added, "Thanks for driving me, Dad." It was the first time she'd called him Dad without it sounding like an accusation. The nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they got worse for a while. The stress of rebuilding a relationship with his daughter, the guilt that had been festering for 10 years, the trauma he'd never properly addressed. All of it came pouring out in his sleep. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, sometimes standing in the middle of the living room, with no memory of how he got in there. And every time it happened, Nora would appear. She never said much. She would just hand him a glass of water, make sure he was oriented to reality, and then go back to bed. After the 4th or 5th time, Marcus couldn't take it anymore. He caught her before she could retreat upstairs. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this is hard to deal with. The nightmares, me waking up screaming. You shouldn't have to." "You're getting help, right?" Nora interrupted, her tone matter of fact. "You're seeing someone about the PTSD. Marcus hesitated. "I've been to the VA before. They offer therapy, but nothing," Nora said firmly. "You promised me you wouldn't run. That means you don't run from getting help either. If the nightmares are this bad, you need to talk to someone who knows how to treat it." She wasn't angry. She wasn't accusatory. She was just stating a fact the way someone might point out that a broken leg needs medical attention. "You're right," Marcus admitted. "I'll call them tomorrow." "Good," Nora said, and then softer. "I'm not trying to be hard on you, Dad. I just need to know that you're actually trying, that you're not going to give up and disappear again." "I won't," Marcus promised. "I'm here. I'm staying. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back upstairs. This time, Marcus heard her pause at the top of the stairs. "Dad," she called down. "Yeah, I'm glad you're here." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, and right now, something was enough. The weekly dinners at the house became a tradition. Every Friday night, a rotating cast of Hell's Angels would show up with food, beer, and stories that ranged from hilarious to terrifying. Nora was intimidated at first by these large, rough men with their leather and their patches and their scarred faces. But she quickly learned what Marcus had discovered beneath the intimidating exterior. Most of them were surprisingly gentle, especially around women and children. Garrett brought his daughter Emma, now 4 months old and thriving. When Marcus held her for the first time, something in his chest cracked open. He looked at the tiny baby in his arms, then at Nora, and felt the full weight of everything he'd missed in her life. Her childhood, her teenage years, her mother's illness and death. "I missed this with you," he said quietly, his voice thick. "I missed everything." Nora, standing beside him, looked at Emma and then at her father. "You can't get those years back," she said. "But you're here now. That has to count for something." It was the closest she'd come to offering forgiveness, and Marcus held on to those words like a lifeline. The peace lasted for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of tentative healing, of small moments of connection of life, slowly returning to something that resembled normal. And then Derek Lawson shattered it. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by hand and left on the front porch. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in block letters and a stack of photographs. The photographs showed Nora, at work, walking to the bus stop, shopping at the grocery store, getting into Marcus's truck. All recent, all taken without her knowledge. The message was simple and terrifying. "You took everything from me. Now I take everything from you." Marcus stared at the photographs, his hands shaking not with fear, but with a cold, focused rage that he hadn't felt since his days in the desert. Nora stood beside him, her face pale but her jaw set with determination. "He didn't leave the city," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You said he would, but he didn't." "No," Marcus agreed. "He didn't. What do we do?" Marcus looked at his daughter, and in that moment he made a decision. He had spent 10 years running from his demons, hiding from his responsibilities, letting fear dictate his choices. Not anymore. "We call war," Marcus said, "and then we end this." But Nora shook her head. "No, we call the police. We show them these photos," the threatening note. "This is stalking. It's illegal. They can arrest him." "The police will tell you to file a report," Marcus said gently. "They'll open an investigation. They might even bring him in for questioning, but Lawson has money and lawyers. He'll post bail and he'll be back on the street in 24 hours. And then he'll be angrier and more dangerous." "So what are you suggesting?" Nora asked, and there was something sharp in her tone. "We handle this ourselves like vigilantes. That's not better, Dad. That's not justice." "I'm suggesting," Marcus said carefully, "that we protect you in a way that actually works. Lawson is a predator. He preys on people he thinks are weak and alone. He sent these photos to intimidate you, to make you feel hunted. So we show him that you're not alone, that you have people willing to stand between you and him." Nora was quiet for a long moment in studying the photographs. "You think he's going to try something, don't you? You think the photos are just the beginning?" "I know they are," Marcus said. "Monsieur, men like Lawson don't just give up. They escalate. And I'm not going to wait for him to hurt you to prove me right." That night, Marcus set a trap. He let Lawson think that Nora was vulnerable, that she was alone. He made it obvious when she would be at the house by herself, created a pattern that someone watching would notice. And then he waited. Nora wasn't actually alone. Marcus was in the house, hidden in the shadows of the living room, every sense on high alert. Warren and Garrett were parked a block away, ready to move at a moment's notice. They had argued about this plan, about using Nora as bait, but she had insisted. This was her fight too. She wanted it over. The attack came at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the photos arrived. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen window was unmistakable. Marcus heard footsteps, careful and slow-moving through the darkened house. He stayed perfectly still, controlling his breathing, every muscle coiled and ready. The footsteps moved up the stairs toward Nora's bedroom. Marcus followed silently, his ranger training flooding back with crystalline clarity. He moved like a ghost, each step placed with precision, making no sound. The intruder reached Nora's door and pushed it open slowly. The figure was backlit by the hallway light, tall and broad-shouldered. Derek Lawson. Marcus stepped out of the shadows directly behind him. "Looking for someone," Marcus said, his voice flat and cold. Lawson spun around, and in his hand was a knife, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade that gleamed in the dim light. "You ruined me," Lawson snarled, his face twisted with rage. "You and your biker friends destroyed everything I built. That house was mine. She was mine. You took it all." "You never owned her," Marcus said, and he was completely calm now. The fear and uncertainty of the past weeks gone and replaced by the cold focus of a soldier facing an enemy. "You never owned anything. You're just a predator who got caught." Lawson lunged the knife, slashing through the air toward Marcus's chest. But Marcus wasn't there anymore. He sidestepped, grabbed Lawson's wrist, and twisted with controlled force. The knife clattered to the floor. Lawson threw a wild punch with his free hand, and it connected with Marcus's jaw hard enough to make stars explode in his vision. They grappled, crashing against the hallway wall. Lawson was younger, heavier, but Marcus had decades of combat training and a lifetime of fighting to survive. He drove his knee into Lawson's stomach, then followed with an elbow to the face that sent the man stumbling backward. Lawson hit the floor hard, blood streaming from his nose, and Marcus was on him immediately. He pinned Lawson to the ground, one knee on his chest, and drew his fist back for a strike that would have ended the fight permanently. And then he heard it, Nora's voice, terrified and desperate. Dad, stop. You'll kill him." Marcus froze, his fist still raised, and looked up. Nora was standing in her bedroom doorway, holding her phone with the emergency number already dialed. Behind her, he could hear sirens in the distance. War must have called to them. Marcus looked down at Lawson, at the blood and the fear in the man's eyes, and something shifted in his chest. The old Marcus, the broken man who had run away from his daughter because he was afraid of what he might do, would have finished this fight with violence, would have let the rage consume him completely. But he wasn't that man anymore. He had someone worth being better for. Marcus lowered his fist and stood up, keeping his boot on Lawson's chest until the police arrived. "It's over," he said, and he was talking to Lawson, but also to himself. "It's done." The police took Lawson away in handcuffs, charged with breaking and entering assault with a deadly weapon and stalking. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs he'd sent, the broken window, the knife on the floor, his own admission of intent caught on Nora's phone recording. This time there would be no bail, no legal maneuvering, just consequences. After the police left and the house was quiet again, Nora found Marcus sitting on the front porch, his hands still shaking with adrenaline. She sat down beside him without saying anything for a long moment. "You could have killed him," she finally said. "I saw your face. You wanted to." "I did," Marcus admitted. "For a second, I wanted to hurt him for everything he did to you, for taking your home, for putting you on the streets, for making you afraid." "But you didn't," Nora said. "You stopped. Why?" Marcus looked at his daughter, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could really see her. Not the 19-year-old girl he'd left behind, not the terrified woman he'd found in that motel room, but the person she actually was. Strong, resilient, his daughter. "Because you asked me to," he said simply. "And because I'm not the man I used to be. The man who left you was afraid of hurting you. So afraid that he hurt you in a different way. But I'm not running anymore, Nora. Not from my demons and not from being your father. And that means making better choices, even when it's hard." Nora was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "I forgive you, Dad." Marcus felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 10 years. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Nora interrupted, "but I'm choosing to. You left because you were scared. You stayed gone because you thought I was better off without you. You were wrong about that. So wrong, but you came back. You found me when I needed you most. And you've shown up every single day since then, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard." She reached over and took his hand. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because holding on to the anger is exhausting, and I'd rather use that energy to build something new." Marcus couldn't speak. He just held his daughter's hand and let the tears fall, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, they were tears of relief rather than grief. 3 months passed. Spring came to Chicago, tentative and uncertain, but it came. The ice melted. The trees began to bud. The world slowly transformed from gray to green. Marcus's nightmares didn't disappear completely, but they became less frequent. The therapy helped, though it was slow and painful work. He attended a support group for combat veterans with PTSD, and hearing other men share stories that mirrored his own made him feel less alone in his struggles. Nora thrived at her job. She was promoted to senior bookkeeper after just 2 months, her organizational skills and attention to detail making her invaluable to the garage's operations. She bought her first car, nothing fancy, but reliable, and hers. She started rebuilding her life piece by piece. The relationship between father and daughter continued to heal. There were still hard days, moments when the past 10 years rose up like a wall between them. But they talked through it. They didn't run from the difficult conversations anymore. They established rituals, Sunday breakfast, where Marcus would inevitably overcook the eggs and Nora would burn the toast and they would laugh about it. Friday movie nights, where they would argue about what to watch and usually end up falling asleep on the couch halfway through. Saturday mornings working in the garden that Nora had started planting, where Marcus discovered he was surprisingly good at growing things when he wasn't trying to burn them. Or organized a memorial service for Eli Brennan on the 34th anniversary of his death. It was a small gathering at the Hells Angels clubhouse, just family and close friends. War spoke about his brother, about the young man who had died too soon, but had lived with honor. Garrett talked about the uncle he'd never met, but whose legacy had shaped his family. And then War asked Marcus to speak. Marcus stood in front of the small crowd, his hands shaking slightly, and talked about Eli. About the young corporal who had taken a bullet meant for someone else. About the 3 days Marcus had spent carrying him across the desert, talking to him constantly, refusing to let him slip away, even when it would have been easier to leave him behind. Eli saved my life by letting me carry him, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. He gave me purpose when I had none. He told me to find his brother, and it took me 34 years, but I found War. And in finding War, I found my way back to my daughter. He looked at Nora sitting in the front row and smiled. Eli's been gone for over 3 decades, but his impact is still rippling through lives. Through War and Garrett and Nora and me. Through everyone here. That's a legacy worth honoring. After the service, War pulled Marcus aside and handed him something wrapped in brown paper. Marcus unwrapped it carefully and found himself looking at the olive drab army blanket, the one he'd given to Garrett that frozen night 3 months ago. It had been professionally cleaned and framed, mounted behind glass with a small brass plaque at the bottom. The plaque read, "One act of kindness can save 2 lives. Chicago, January 2025. Thought you might want this," War said gruffly. As a reminder of what? That even when you think you have nothing left to give, you still have something. And sometimes that something changes everything. Marcus hung the framed blanket in the living room right above the couch where he'd first slept when he came to this house. Nora came home from work that evening and stopped in her tracks when she saw it. "Is that the blanket?" she asked. "It is." She walked over to it, studying the worn wool behind the glass. "If you hadn't given this away, I'd be dead," Marcus finished, "and you'd still be out there, and we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation." Nora reached out and touched the frame gently. "It's strange how things work out sometimes, how one choice can change everything." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, "it is." They stood there together, looking at the framed blanket, and Marcus thought about the chain of events that had led them here. A frozen night, a broken-down motorcycle, a stranger who needed help, a choice to give away the only thing keeping him alive. And somehow, impossibly, it had all led to this, to standing in a warm house with his daughter, building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. One evening in late spring, Marcus and Nora sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of orange and pink. It had become their ritual, this quiet time at the end of the day, where they would just sit together and talk about everything and nothing. "I've been thinking," Nora said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about forgiveness, about what it means." "What does it mean?" Marcus asked. "I think it means letting go of the anger without forgetting what happened. It means acknowledging that people are complicated and broken, and sometimes they make terrible choices for reasons that make sense to them at the time, even if those reasons seem insane to everyone else." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You left because you thought it was the right thing to do. You were wrong, spectacularly wrong, but you genuinely believed you were protecting me. And then you came back. You didn't have to. You could have stayed hidden, stayed invisible, and stayed safe in your own way. But you came back. You found me. You fought for me. You showed up every single day, even when I made it clear I wasn't ready to forgive you yet." She turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but also peace. "That's why I can forgive you, Dad. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because the present matters more. Because you're here now, and you're trying, and that has to be enough." Marcus felt his own eyes burning. "I don't know if I deserve—" "Nobody deserves forgiveness," Nora interrupted gently. "That's why it's called grace. It's a gift, and I'm choosing to give it to you. Not because you earned it, but because carrying the weight of that anger was killing me too. We both get to be free now." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the light fade from the sky and the streetlights flicker to life one by one. Somewhere down the block, they could hear the rumble of motorcycles as several Hells Angels arrived for the weekly Friday dinner that had become tradition. "What do you think happens now?" Nora asked. "Where do we go from here?" Marcus considered the question. "I think we keep showing up. We keep having burnt toast breakfasts and overcooked egg dinners. We keep talking through the hard stuff instead of running from it. We keep building something new on the foundation of what we lost. And maybe eventually we figure out what a healthy father-daughter relationship looks like when both people are trying their best." "That sounds nice," Nora said, and then softer. "I love you, Dad. I don't think I've said that in a long time. Maybe ever, but I do." Marcus wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders and pulled her close. "I love you too, kiddo, more than I have words for." As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus thought about how different his life looked now compared to 3 months ago. Then he had been sleeping on frozen cardboard beneath an overpass, convinced he would die alone and unmourned. Now he was sitting on a porch swing with his daughter, surrounded by friends who had become family in a house that felt like home. The journey from that frozen January night to this warm spring evening had been painful and difficult and messy. There had been tears and anger and hard conversations that felt impossible. There had been moments when he'd wanted to run, to disappear back into the comfortable numbness of invisibility. But he'd stayed. He'd shown up. He'd done the work. And somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, and Marcus saw Garrett's massive road glide pull into the driveway, followed by War's bike and several others. Garrett climbed off his bike carrying baby Emma in one arm and a bag of takeout food in the other. War followed with more food and a case of beer. "You two planning to sit out here all night, or are you going to help us eat all this food?" War called out. Nora stood up and offered Marcus her hand. "Come on, Dad. Family's here." Marcus took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. Together they walked into the house, into the warmth and noise and chaos of a Friday night dinner with their chosen family. The framed blanket on the wall caught the light from the kitchen, the olive drab wool, a testament to the night that had changed everything. Nora paused as they passed it, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "You know what's strange?" she said softly. "That blanket was supposed to be the end of your story, but it was actually the beginning of ours." Marcus looked at the blanket, then at his daughter, and smiled. "Best trade I ever made." They stepped into the kitchen, where War was already telling a story that had Garrett laughing. Emma cooed from her carrier on the counter. The smell of Chinese takeout filled the air. The house was alive with voices and warmth and the kind of chaos that only comes from family who actually chooses to be together. Marcus sat down at the kitchen island next to his daughter, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, the Chicago skyline glowed against the darkening sky. Inside, the light spilled warm and golden from every window of the house. The framed blanket was visible through the living room window, a small square of olive drab wool that had somehow saved 3 lives and brought a family back together. Sometimes the coldest night leads to the warmest sunrise, Marcus thought. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. Sometimes the worst choice you ever made becomes the path to redemption you didn't know you needed. He looked around the kitchen at the faces of people who had saved him in every way a person could be saved, and he felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. He felt like he belonged somewhere, like he mattered to someone, like he had a future worth living for. The past couldn't be changed. The 10 years he'd lost with Nora couldn't be recovered. The trauma and pain and suffering couldn't be erased. But they could be transformed. They could become the foundation for something new, something better, something worth fighting for. Marcus had given away a blanket, expecting to deal alone in the cold. Instead, he'd found family. He'd found redemption. He'd found his daughter. He'd found himself. And that was worth every frozen night, every nightmare, every difficult conversation, every moment of doubt. It was worth everything.